My life was a quiet archive, each day a neatly catalogued entry of books and silence. I believed my parents were academics, gentle souls who had fled Russia for a peaceful life in Boston. I believed their death in a plane crash was a tragic, random accident. For 3 days, I lived in the hollowed-out shell of that belief, a ghost in my own apartment, surrounded by the wilting flowers of a life that was already a lie. Then he came. The man who knocked on my door was not a lawyer offering condolences. He was an undertaker for a life I didn't know I'd had. His name was Orlov, and he was carved from the Russian winter itself. All harsh angles and chilling indifference. He didn't speak of accidents. He spoke of assassinations. In the space of a single, brutal conversation, my world was burned to the ground. My parents, Aleksandr and Katerina Petrov, were not academics. They were the heads of the Petrova Bratva, a feared Moscow mafia organization whose power was written in blood and fear. Their death wasn't a tragedy. It was a strategic move in a war I never knew they were fighting. As the last of my line, I inherited their bloody empire. But the inheritance was not a gift. It was a shackle. It came with a single, non-negotiable clause written in my father's will, a dead man's command that reached across an ocean to claim me, to become the head of the family, to be granted their protection from the enemies who now hunted me. I was to immediately fly to Moscow and marry Dmitry Volkov. The name was spoken with a cold finality that offered no room for argument. Dmitry Volkov, my father's Pakhan, his second in command. A man whose reputation preceded him in the chilling silence of Orlov's explanation, a monster forged in the Siberian winter. A ruthless enforcer who now held the reins of my family's kingdom. My protests were met with a cold, simple reality. My bank accounts were frozen. My passport was void. My future had been rewritten by a dead man's hand. 2 hours later, with a single suitcase and the ghost of a life I once knew, I was on a private jet, hurtling toward a frozen, unfamiliar country. I wasn't flying to Moscow to claim an inheritance. I was being delivered to my king, my captor, my husband. The quiet archivist was dead. In her place was a voiceless heir, a puppet queen being flown into the heart of a war she didn't understand, to marry a man she was already certain she would hate. Part 1. The Will of the Voiceless History. I had always believed was a quiet thing. It lived in the brittle, yellowed pages of forgotten books, in the delicate scent of aging paper and dried ink, in the hushed, reverent silence of the university archive where I spent my days. It was a world of order, of facts and footnotes, a carefully constructed narrative of the past, my life, like the archives I so meticulously curated, was a study in quiet, predictable order. I was Anya Petrova, 23 years old, a recent history graduate with a passion for the obscure and a life that was as neat and catalogued as the documents I handled. My world was my small, book-crammed apartment in Boston's Back Bay, the comforting aroma of old paper, and the quiet, scholarly love of my parents, Aleksandr and Katerina Petrov. They were academics, like me, quiet, gentle souls who had emigrated from Russia before I was born, leaving behind a world they never spoke of to build a new, peaceful life in America. They were my everything, the twin pillars of my small, safe world. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, my world ended. It ended not with a bang, but with the sterile, dispassionate hum of a television news report. I was in my apartment, a rare day off, surrounded by stacks of books, a half-empty cup of tea growing cold at my elbow. The television was on for background noise. A low, murmuring counterpoint to the quiet scratch of my pen as I made notes in the margins of a dense, scholarly text. I wasn't really listening, until I was. The wreckage of the private jet, which went down in the Swiss Alps late last night amidst treacherous weather conditions. My pen stilled. A cold, prickling sensation, a strange premonitory dread, crawled up the back of my neck. Officials have now released the names of the 2 passengers, the only souls on board. They have been identified as Boston-based academics Aleksandr and Katerina Petrov. The world dissolved. The words on the page in front of me blurred into an incomprehensible scrawl. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The quiet hum of the television became a roar, a tidal wave of sound that crashed over me, dragging me under into a cold, dark, silent abyss. It was a mechanical failure, they said, a tragic, unavoidable accident. The words were a neat, tidy explanation, a simple, logical conclusion to a complex, beautiful equation. But they were wrong. My parents were not the kind of people to whom accidents happened. They were meticulous planners, cautious to a fault. They did not take risks. They did not fly in private jets through treacherous weather. The days that followed were a blur of numb, disbelieving grief. Friends of my parents, fellow academics with kind, sad eyes, came and went. Their voices a low, soothing murmur of condolences that I barely heard. They brought casseroles that I didn't eat and offered platitudes that I didn't believe. My apartment, once my sanctuary, became a mausoleum, thick with the scent of wilting flowers and the oppressive weight of a silence that was no longer peaceful, but predatory. The funeral was a small, quiet affair, a gathering of a handful of colleagues and friends. I stood by the graveside, a black-clad ghost in a world that had lost all its color, and I listened to the eulogies, the carefully chosen words that painted a picture of a quiet, scholarly couple, of a life of books and lectures and gentle, unassuming love. It was a beautiful picture, and it was a lie. I didn't know how I knew, but I knew. I felt it in the hollow, aching space in my chest, in the cold, hard knot of certainty that had taken root in my gut. It was 3 days after the funeral that he came. I was sitting in the dim, funereal light of my living room, staring at a photograph of my parents, trying to reconcile the warm, smiling faces in the frame with the cold, hard fact of their absence. The knock on the door was sharp, decisive, a sound of authority that was utterly out of place in the quiet, grief-stricken stillness of my apartment. I opened the door to a man who seemed to have been carved from the Russian winter itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a severe, impeccably tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the faint light of the corridor. His face was a mask of harsh, Slavic plains, his eyes a pale, chilling gray, the color of a frozen sky. He was not like any lawyer I had ever met. He did not have the soft, sympathetic demeanor of a man accustomed to dealing with the bereaved. He had the cold, imposing stillness of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. "Anya Petrova," he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, the Russian accent thick and undisguised. I nodded, my throat tight. "My name is Orlov," he said. "I was your father's legal counsel." He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word of condolence. He simply looked at me with those cold, assessing gray eyes, as if I were a line item on a ledger, a problem to be dealt with. He stepped into my apartment without waiting for an invitation, his large frame seeming to shrink the already small space. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his presence a chilling intrusion into the sanctuary of my grief. "Your parents' death was not an accident," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless statement of fact. He did not sit. He stood in the center of my living room, a dark, monolithic figure. And he watched me, his gaze unwavering. It was an assassination. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cold as shards of ice. I should have been shocked. I should have been horrified. But all I felt was a strange, grim sense of validation. The dissonant note that had been humming in the back of my mind since the news report had finally resolved into a clear, terrifying chord. "Who?" I whispered. The single word, a raw, ragged thing. "A rival family," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The Chekhovs. An old and persistent problem." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of books. The framed prints of historical maps. The quiet, scholarly clutter of my life. "Your parents were not the people you thought they were. Ms. Petrova, they were not academics. They were the heads of the Petrova Bratva." Bratva. The word was a foreign, brutal sound on his tongue. The Russian mafia. My mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible. Ludicrous statement. My parents. My quiet, gentle, book-loving parents. It was insane. It was a scene from a bad movie. But as I looked at the cold, hard certainty in Orlov's eyes, I knew he was not lying. My entire life, my entire identity, was a carefully constructed fiction, a beautiful, elaborate lie designed to protect me from a world I never knew existed. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't need to understand," he said, his tone dismissive. "You only need to listen." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit and produced a thick, sealed envelope. "This is your father's will, his zaveshchanie, his final, binding testament." He broke the seal with a sharp, decisive flick of his thumb and began to read. The legal jargon was a dense, impenetrable fog, but the core of it was brutally, terrifyingly clear. "I, Anya Petrova, as the last of the Petrova line, was the sole heir to my father's entire empire, an empire not of academic accolades and scholarly publications, but of blood and money and a power so vast I could not begin to comprehend it. But the inheritance came with a condition, a brutal, non-negotiable clause that was a shackle, a chain, a life sentence, to claim my title, to be recognized as the new head of the Petrova family, to be safe from my parents' enemies. I had to fly to Moscow, immediately, and I had to marry Dmitry Volkov. Dmitry Volkov, my father's Pakhan, his second in command, the man who, in my father's absence, now held the reins of the Petrova Bratva. "No," I said, the word a choked, disbelieving gasp. "Absolutely not." Orlov stopped reading and looked at me, his pale gray eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been pity, but was more likely just cold, pragmatic impatience. "It is not a request, Ms. Petrova. It is a command. Your father's final command." "I won't do it," I said, my voice rising, a hysterical, desperate edge creeping into it. "You can't make me." "I don't have to," he said, his voice a flat, unyielding thing. "Your father has already made you. Your life here is over. The university has been informed of your indefinite leave of absence. Your bank accounts have been frozen. The only asset you now possess is a one-way ticket to Moscow. on a private jet that leaves in 2 hours. He placed the ticket on the coffee table beside the will, a single, stark white rectangle against the dark wood, a death sentence, a new life. I was a prisoner of a life I never knew I had, a prisoner of a dead man's will. The flight to Moscow was a surreal, isolating, 10-hour-long limbo between two worlds. The private jet was a capsule of obscene luxury, all soft cream leather and polished chrome, a silent, sterile bubble hurtling through the dark. Empty sky. A flight attendant with a face as blank and perfect as a porcelain doll offered me champagne that I couldn't stomach and food that I couldn't eat. I spent the hours staring out the small, oval window, watching the familiar constellations of my old world give way to the strange, unfamiliar patterns of a new one. I was trying to reconcile the two opposing images of my parents that were now at war in my mind. The warm, loving academics who had read me bedtime stories and encouraged my passion for history. And the cold, ruthless leaders of a criminal empire, the monstrous figures Orlov had described. I pulled a small, worn photo album from my carry-on bag, the only personal item I had had the presence of mind to grab before Orlov had escorted me from my apartment. I flipped through the pages, the images of a happy, normal family life now seeming like a cruel, elaborate fiction. My father, with his kind, scholarly eyes and gentle smile, holding me on his shoulders at a 4th of July picnic. My mother, her face a mask of serene, quiet beauty, helping me build a sandcastle on a beach in Cape Cod. Who were they? Who were these strangers who had raised me, loved me, and lied to me with every breath they took? The grief was still there, a raw, gaping wound in my chest, but it was now tangled with a new, more complex emotion, a cold, bitter, and profound anger. As the jet began its descent, the first light of a gray, Russian dawn broke through the clouds. I looked down at the sprawling, unfamiliar landscape below, a vast monochrome tapestry of concrete and snow. The city of Moscow. My new home, my new prison. The jet landed at a private airfield on the outskirts of the city. The air was still, the sky a flat, oppressive sheet of gray. The door of the jet opened to a blast of frigid, biting air that stole the breath from my lungs. A line of black, imposing sedans waited on the tarmac, their engines a low, menacing hum in the frozen silence, and standing in front of them was a man. He was even more intimidating than I had imagined. He was tall, broad-shouldered, a monolith of a man dressed in a long black wool coat that did nothing to hide the raw, brutal power in his frame. His face was hard, emotionless, carved from the same unforgiving granite as the city itself. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, a pale, chilling blue-gray that held no warmth, no light. His body was a canvas of dark, intricate prison tattoos that crept up the strong column of his neck and onto the backs of his large, powerful hands. They were a declaration, a story of violence and survival written in ink. He said nothing. He simply watched me as I descended the steps of the jet, his gaze cold and assessing, as if he were inspecting a piece of property, a new acquisition. He did not offer a hand. He did not offer a word of comfort. He was a wall of ice and steel, a creature of this cold, brutal, and unforgiving world. This was Dmitry Volkov, my future husband, my jailer, Orlov, who had been a silent, imposing presence at my side throughout the flight. Handed him my single suitcase. Dmitry took it. his touch impersonal, his gaze never leaving my face. Then, with a curt, dismissive gesture, he indicated the open door of the lead car. The silent ride into the city began. I was trapped in the back seat of the luxurious car, the scent of leather and cold, clean air filling my lungs. I stared out the window at the passing landscape. The grim, monolithic apartment blocks, the snow-dusted streets, the gray, unsmiling faces of the people. Dmitri sat beside me, a silent, brooding presence. He did not speak. He did not look at me. He simply stared straight ahead, his large hands resting on his knees, his face a mask of cold, unreadable indifference. He radiated a cold, brutal power unlike anything I had ever known, a power that was as much a part of him as the tattoos on his skin. The cage was no longer gilded. It was forged from the Russian winter itself, from the cold, hard steel of this man's soul. And I was trapped inside, a voiceless, powerless heir to a kingdom of ashes. Part 2. The Gilded Cage. The wedding was a spectacle of obscene opulence and soul-crushing coldness. It took place in a grand, ancient Orthodox cathedral on the banks of the Moskva River, a place that smelled of melting beeswax, cold stone, and centuries of secrets. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a cloying, sweet perfume that did nothing to mask the metallic tang of fear in the back of my throat. I was a ghost at my own wedding, a pale, black-clad American girl adrift in a sea of stern, Slavic faces and glittering, unfamiliar jewels. I was dressed in a severe but exquisitely tailored black dress that Orlov's silent, efficient assistants had provided. My only adornment the simple gold locket my mother had given me for my 16th birthday. It felt like a relic from another life, a fragile, hollow thing against the heavy, suffocating weight of my new reality. The cathedral was filled with the bratva. They were a silent, imposing army of men in dark suits, their faces hard and unreadable, their eyes holding the cold, flat look of predators. Their women were just as intimidating. Draped in furs and diamonds, their painted faces masks of cool, assessing indifference. They looked at me not with welcome, but with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. I was an outsider, an anomaly, a soft, foreign thing that had been thrust into their hard, brutal world. And then there was Dmitri. He stood at the altar, a monolith of a man, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his perfectly tailored black suit. He was a creature of shadows and ice, his face a mask of cold, unyielding control. He did not look at me as I walked down the long, echoing aisle on Orlov's arm. He stared straight ahead, at the gilded iconostasis, his expression as remote and unforgiving as a Siberian winter. The ceremony was a blur of ancient, incomprehensible Russian, the priest's voice a low, monotonous chant that echoed in the vast vaulted space. I felt like a sacrificial lamb being led to the slaughter, a voiceless offering in a ritual I did not understand. When the time came for the vows, Dmitri's voice was a low, gravelly rumble, the Russian words a cold, binding chain that wrapped around my soul. My own voice, when I was prompted to speak, was a reedy, trembling whisper, the unfamiliar words a bitter, foreign taste on my tongue. He placed a heavy, ornate gold band on my finger. It was cold and impossibly heavy, a manacle that sealed my fate. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes, those chilling, pale blue-gray eyes, held no warmth, no emotion, only a cold, possessive finality. He was not my husband, he was my owner. The reception was held at a lavish, heavily guarded mansion on the outskirts of Moscow. A sprawling, opulent fortress of marble and glass that overlooked a frozen, snow-dusted forest. This, I learned with a sinking, cold dread, was my new home, my new prison. It was a gilded cage, a masterpiece of cold, impersonal luxury. The floors were polished black marble, the walls adorned with modern, abstract art that was as soulless and intimidating as the people who now surrounded me. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, cigar smoke, and the cloying, sweet smell of fear. I moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost. A glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking clutched in my numb hand. Men with faces like maps of hard roads would nod at me, their eyes cold and assessing. Women with diamonds dripping from their ears would offer me thin, brittle smiles that did not reach their eyes. I was the new Tsarina, the puppet queen, and they were all watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, to show a weakness, to prove that I was the soft, unworthy American they all believed me to be. Dmitri was a constant, silent presence at my side, his hand a heavy, proprietary weight on the small of my back. He was a wall of ice and steel, shielding me from the curious, predatory gazes, but also trapping me in his cold, suffocating orbit. He introduced me to his inner circle, his Sovetniki, a group of hard, older men with the dead eyes of killers. They were the pillars of the Petrova Empire, the men who had been loyal to my father, and who now, I realized, were loyal only to the man who stood beside me. The wedding night was not a night of passion. It was a night of negotiation, a cold, brutal laying down of the law. Dmitri led me to the master suite, a vast, cavernous room decorated in shades of black and gray, with a wall of glass that offered a panoramic, moonlit view of the frozen forest. It was a beautiful, desolate, and utterly terrifying room. He did not touch me. He did not even look at me with anything resembling desire. He stood by the window, a dark, imposing silhouette against the stark, white landscape, and he laid out the terms of my imprisonment. "You are my wife," he said, his voice a low, flat rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "You will live in this house. You will want for nothing. You will be protected. But you will be a prisoner. You will not leave this estate without my permission, and without an escort. You will not make contact with your old life. You will not question my business. You will not question my authority. You will be a ghost, a name, a symbol. You will be Anya Petrova, the head of this family, in name only. I will be the one who rules." He turned to face me then, his eyes a chilling, pale fire in the dim light. "You are a liability, Anya, a soft, American girl who knows nothing of this world. You are a weakness, and I do not tolerate weakness. Do you understand?" I stood there, my heart a cold, hard knot of fear and a new, unfamiliar emotion, a hot, searing, and profound anger. I had been stripped of my life, my identity, my future. I had been sold, bartered, and shackled to this cold, brutal man. I would not be his puppet. I would not be his ghost. "I understand," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, my chin lifting in a small, almost imperceptible act of defiance. "But you are mistaken about one thing, Dmitri. I am not weak." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or a grudging, almost imperceptible respect passed through his eyes before they turned to ice again. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "We shall see," he said, and then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the vast, cold, and silent cage he had built for me. The days that followed were a study in empty, suffocating luxury. I was a prisoner in a palace, a ghost haunting the long, silent corridors of a house that was not a home. I had a staff of silent, watchful servants who catered to my every need, a wardrobe of designer clothes I had no desire to wear, and a library filled with rare, leather-bound books that offered no comfort. I explored my gilded cage, mapping its boundaries, learning its rhythms. The mansion was a fortress, its walls thick, its windows bulletproof, its grounds patrolled by an army of silent, black-clad guards. There was no escape. Dmitri was a phantom, a creature of the night. He would leave before dawn. A low, powerful growl of his armored car the only sign of his departure. He would return late, long after I had retreated to my own suite of rooms, a separate, isolated wing of the vast mansion. I rarely saw him, but I felt his presence everywhere. It was in the way the staff moved with a hushed, fearful efficiency, in the cold, oppressive silence of the house, in the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. He began my education, as he had so coldly called it. He would leave files on the table in my sitting room, unmarked manila folders filled with the brutal, unvarnished truth of the world I now inhabited. Police reports detailing gruesome, unsolved murders, financial statements that traced a complex, global web of money laundering and extortion, grainy surveillance photos of men with dead eyes exchanging briefcases in dark, anonymous alleyways. He was showing me the blood and the ink that were the foundation of the Petrova Empire. He was showing me the monster he was, the monster my father had been. He expected me to be horrified, to be repulsed, to break. He expected me to retreat into my gilded cage and become the docile, ornamental wife he wanted me to be. I was horrified. I was repulsed. But I did not break. Instead, a strange, cold curiosity began to take root in the ashes of my old life. I began to read the files not with the emotional, visceral horror of a victim, but with the cool, analytical detachment of a historian. I began to see the patterns, the strategies, the brutal, cold logic of this world. I began to understand. My first act of defiance was not a dramatic, futile escape attempt. It was a small, quiet, and, in its own way, far more dangerous act of rebellion. One evening, Dmitri was hosting a dinner for his sovetniki, his inner circle of advisors. I was expected to be there, a silent, beautiful, and utterly decorative presence at the head of the long, polished dining table. I sat through the endless courses of rich, elaborate food, listening to the low, guttural murmur of Russian, the clink of crystal and silver, the thick, cloying smell of cigar smoke. They spoke of violence and death with a casual, almost bored indifference, as if they were discussing the weather or the price of oil. Dmitri, at the other end of the table, was in his element. He was the czar in his court, his authority absolute, his every word a command. He was a creature of pure, unadulterated power. They were discussing a problem with a new smuggling route through the Baltics, a dispute with a rival Lithuanian gang. The conversation was a stalemate, a circular argument of threats and counter-threats. And then, I spoke. You are approaching it from the wrong direction, I said, my voice a clear, quiet note in the thick, masculine silence. The room went still. A dozen pairs of hard, cold eyes turned to me. I could feel Dmitri's gaze on me, a physical weight, a blast of pure, icy fury. I had broken the most sacred rule. I had spoken. I ignored the fear, the cold, hard knot of it in my stomach, and I continued, my voice gaining a new, unfamiliar strength. You are thinking like warriors. You should be thinking like historians. The Lithuanians are not a new problem. They have a history with the Petrova family, a history of broken treaties and bad blood that goes back 2 generations. They are not motivated by profit. They are motivated by pride. You cannot buy them. You cannot intimidate them. But you can humiliate them. I laid out a plan, a simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless strategy based not on brute force, but on a deep, historical understanding of our enemy's weaknesses. It was a plan that would not just defeat them, but would dismantle their honor, their pride, the very foundation of their power. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. I looked down the long, polished table at Dmitri. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes unreadable, but I saw it. A flicker, a spark of something in the depths of his frozen gaze. It was not anger. It was not surprise. It was a grudging, almost imperceptible, and utterly terrifying respect. That night, he did not leave me to the cold, empty silence of my own wing. He came to my room. He stood in the doorway, a dark, imposing figure, and he watched me for a long, silent moment. You are a dangerous woman, Anya Petrova, he said, his voice a low, rough thing. I had a good teacher, I retorted, my own voice a cool, steady counterpoint to the wild, frantic beating of my heart. He walked toward me, and the air in the room grew thick, heavy, charged with a new, more potent form of tension. This was not the cold, indifferent jailer. This was something else. This was a man, a predator, who had just seen his prey bare its teeth. He stopped in front of me, so close I could feel the heat of his body, so close I could see the intricate, swirling patterns of the tattoos on his neck. He reached out and cupped my jaw, his hand a rough, calloused cage around my face. You think you are clever, he murmured, his thumb stroking my bottom lip, a slow, deliberate, and utterly possessive gesture. You think you can play this game, but you have no idea of the rules. You have no idea of the stakes. He leaned in, his mouth inches from mine, his breath a warm, whiskey-scented caress against my skin. You are in my world now. Zhena, he whispered. The Russian word for wife, a strange, intimate, and terrifying sound on his tongue. And in my world, the queen does not just advise the king, she belongs to him. And then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of possession, a brutal, punishing, and utterly devastating claiming. And as his mouth plundered mine, as his body pinned me against the cold, hard wall of my gilded cage, I knew that the real war, the one for my body, my heart, my very soul, had just begun. Part 3, Lessons in Blood. The morning after the kiss was a study in cold, deliberate indifference. I woke in the vast, silent expanse of my bed, the scent of him whiskey and the sharp, clean fragrance of the Russian winter a ghost in the air. The memory of his mouth on mine was a brand, a searing imprint on my lips that felt both like a violation and a dark, shameful thrill. He had taken something from me, a first kiss I hadn't even known I was saving. And he had done it with the casual, possessive arrogance of a king claiming his tribute. I expected something. A change in the frigid atmosphere of the house, a flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes, a shift in the suffocating tension that defined our shared existence. I got nothing. He was gone before I woke. The low growl of his armored Mercedes, a distant, fading rumble in the gray dawn. He left no note. He sent no message. It was as if the raw, brutal intimacy we had shared had been a dream. A feverish hallucination born of grief and anger and the suffocating proximity of our gilded cage. The silence of the mansion was different now. It was no longer just empty. It was mocking. It echoed with the ghost of his touch, the memory of his harsh, possessive words. You are in my world now, Jaina, and in my world. The queen does not just advise the king. She belongs to him. The anger, the hot, searing anger that had been my shield since I had arrived in this cold, brutal country, returned with a vengeance. He had kissed me, had branded me, and then he had simply walked away, leaving me to grapple with the chaotic, terrifying symphony of emotions he had unleashed inside me. He was playing a game, a cruel, psychological chess match, and I was a pawn, a queen in name only, moved across the board at his whim. I would not be his pawn. That evening, he returned. I heard the crunch of his car on the gravel driveway, the heavy, final thud of the front door closing. I was in the library, a vast two-story room with a cold, unlit fireplace and shelves of leather-bound books that seemed to absorb all the warmth from the air. I was pretending to read. A thick, dusty volume of Russian history open on my lap. My heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. He entered without a sound, a dark, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored black suit. He did not look at me. He walked to the massive, polished mahogany desk that had once been my father's and began to sort through a stack of papers. The only sound in the room was the soft, crisp rustle of the pages. The silence stretched, a taut, vibrating wire of tension. I could feel his awareness of me, a physical weight in the room. He was ignoring me, and the deliberate, calculated nature of the dismissal was more infuriating than any shouted threat. Finally, I could bear it no longer. I closed my book with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed in the silent room. His hands stilled on the papers, but he did not look up. "Did you enjoy your day?" I asked. My voice a cool, clipped thing, a poor imitation of his own icy control. He looked up then, his pale, chilling eyes meeting mine across the vast, empty space of the room. A flicker of something amusement, perhaps, or a cold, cruel satisfaction passed through his gaze. It was productive, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He was a bastard, a cold, arrogant, manipulative bastard. And I hated him with a passion so pure, so intense. It was almost a physical force. "I'm glad to hear it," I said, my voice dripping with a saccharine sweetness that was a mockery of my old, naive self. I, too, had a productive day. I catalogued the entire section on 18th century Russian military history. Fascinating stuff. He watched me, his head tilted slightly, a predator observing the strange, defiant posturing of its prey. "Is that so?" "Yes," I said, my voice gaining a new, sharper edge. "I learned, for instance, that Tsar Peter the Great had a particular fondness for public displays of power. He understood that fear was a far more effective tool of control than loyalty. A lesson, I'm sure, you are well acquainted with. A slow, cold smile touched his lips. It did not reach his eyes. You have been doing your homework. Jaina. I'm a historian, I retorted. It's what I do. I study the past to understand the present. And what have you come to understand about your present? He asked, his voice a silken, dangerous thing. I stood, the heavy book in my hand, and I walked toward him, my heels clicking a sharp, defiant rhythm on the marble floor. I stopped in front of the desk, the massive, polished expanse of it a barrier between us. I have come to understand, I said, my voice a low, steady thing, that I am a queen in a kingdom I do not recognize, married to a king I despise. And I have come to understand that a queen who does not understand the nature of her own power is nothing more than a prisoner. He leaned back in his chair, the leather groaning softly under his weight. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time since he had returned. His gaze was no longer just cold and assessing. It was sharp, intelligent, and filled with a new, dangerous curiosity. Then perhaps, he said, his voice a low, challenging murmur, it is time for your education to begin in earnest. His idea of an education was not a lecture, it was a baptism by fire. The next morning, he did not leave me in the silent, suffocating confines of the mansion. He took me with him. Where are we going? I asked, my voice a tight, nervous thing as I sat beside him in the back of his armored Mercedes. The car was a silent, hermetically sealed capsule, the windows tinted so dark the world outside was a gray, muted blur. A lesson, he said, his voice a flat, uninflected thing. He did not look at me. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of stone. We drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the opulent, guarded suburbs of Moscow behind for the grim, industrial outskirts of the city. We pulled up to a large, anonymous warehouse, its corrugated metal walls stained with rust and grime. Two of Dmitri's men, silent, black-clad figures with the dead eyes of sharks, opened our doors. The air inside the warehouse was cold and damp, thick with the smell of rust, oil, and something else. Something metallic and faintly sweet that made my stomach clench. It was the smell of old blood. The space was vast, cavernous, lit by the weak yellow glow of a few bare bulbs hanging from the high, steel-raftered ceiling. In the center of the vast, empty space was a single wooden chair. A man was tied to it. He was a small, wiry man with a face that was a pale, sweaty mask of terror. His clothes were torn, his lips split and bleeding. Dmitri walked toward him, his footsteps a slow, measured, and utterly terrifying echo in the vast, silent space. I followed, my own feet feeling like lead, my body a cold, numb, and unwilling vessel. This is Anatoly, Dmitri said, his voice a calm, conversational thing that was a terrifying counterpoint to the scene in front of me. He circled the chair, his movements fluid and predatory. Anatoly was a business associate. He was responsible for overseeing one of our shipping routes. It seems, however, that Anatoly has been skimming, a small amount, at first, but greed, as you know, is a hungry beast. He stopped in front of the chair and looked down at the terrified man. Anatoly, he said, his voice dropping to a soft, almost gentle murmur, has been stealing from the Petrova family. And that is a sin that requires a confession. He did not lay a hand on the man himself. He did not need to. He simply stood there, his presence a suffocating weight of pure, unadulterated menace, and he directed his men with quiet, chilling, and brutally efficient commands. The interrogation was not a chaotic, frenzied beating. It was a cold, methodical, and terrifyingly precise process. It was a symphony of violence, and Dmitri was its conductor. I was forced to watch as they dismantled the man, piece by painful piece, not just his body, but his spirit. I felt sick, a hot, acidic bile rising in my throat, but a part of me, the cold, analytical historian's mind, was morbidly fascinated by the raw, brutal display of power and psychology. I saw the way Dmitri used silence as a weapon, the way he would ask a quiet, seemingly innocuous question that would make the man's eyes widen in terror. I refused to look away. I refused to show weakness. I stood there, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, my face a blank, emotionless mask, and I watched. It was a small, futile act of defiance, a refusal to be the fainting, hysterical woman he expected me to be. And I knew, from the way his cold, pale eyes would flicker to my face, that he noticed, when it was over, when the broken, sobbing man had confessed everything. Dmitri turned to me. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes held a strange, almost clinical curiosity. What was his mistake, he asked. His voice, a low, academic thing, as if we were discussing a failed military campaign from one of my history books. I stared at him, my mind reeling, my stomach churning. I should have been silent. I should have been horrified. But the words came out. My voice, a cold, steady thing I didn't recognize as my own. He was loyal to the wrong person, I said. He wasn't stealing for himself. He was stealing for someone higher up in the Chekhov organization. He was a soldier, not a general. You broke a pawn. But the king is still on the board. A flicker of something surprise, admiration, a grudging, almost imperceptible respect passed through Dmitri's eyes. He had expected a moral judgment. He had gotten a strategic analysis. The lessons continued. He took me to a high-end, exclusive nightclub in the heart of Moscow, a glittering, decadent world of beautiful people, expensive champagne, and carefully constructed lies. It was a front for his operations, a place where deals were made and secrets were traded. I watched him navigate this world with an effortless, predatory charm, his smile a cold, beautiful, and utterly deadly weapon. He was a king in this court, too, a master of a different, more subtle kind of violence. I saw the other side of his world, the glamour, the money, the seductive, intoxicating pull of his power. I saw the way women looked at him, their eyes full of a hungry, desperate desire. I saw the way men deferred to him, their voices hushed, their gazes a mixture of fear and awe. During the evening, I had a tense, almost silent encounter with one of his lieutenants, a man named Victor with a face like a clenched fist and the dead eyes of a killer. He looked at me with a cold, undisguised contempt, as if I were a piece of decorative fluff, a foreign contamination in his hard, masculine world. He was testing me, his silence a challenge, a dismissal. I met his gaze, my own eyes as cold and steady as I could make them. I did not smile. I did not speak. I simply looked at him, and in the silent, charged space between us, I let him see that I was not afraid of him. I was the wife of his pecan, the queen of this dark kingdom, and I would not be dismissed. He was the first to look away. Back in my gilded cage, I did not just passively receive Dmitri's brutal lessons. I began my own research. The mansion's library, a vast silent room that had once been my father's sanctuary, became my war room. I began to study the history of the Bratva, the intricate, bloody tapestry of its alliances and betrayals. I read about the rival families, the Chekhovs, the Volkovs, the Orlovs. I learned their strengths, their weaknesses, their histories. I began to arm myself with the only weapon I had knowledge. The third lesson was the point of no return. He took me to a remote dacha deep in the frozen, snow-covered woods outside of Moscow. It was a simple, rustic log cabin, a stark contrast to the cold, modern opulence of the mansion. The air was still, the silence absolute, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the fresh snow. A traitor had been caught. A man from Dmitri's own inner circle. A man who had been selling information to the Chekhovs. This time, it was not an interrogation. It was an execution. He forced me to be present for the final, brutal act. He wanted to see me break. He wanted to shatter the last stubborn remnants of my American softness, to remake me in the image of his own hard, unforgiving world. The scene was a stark, brutal, and unforgettable tableau. The traitor, a man I had seen at the dining table in the mansion, was on his knees in the snow, his face a mask of pale, pleading terror. Dmitri stood before him, a dark, imposing figure against the white, unforgiving landscape. He did not hesitate. He did not flinch. The sound of the single gunshot was a sharp, clean, and utterly final crack in the frozen silence. I was horrified. I was shaken to my very core. I turned away and threw up in the snow, my body racked with a violent, uncontrollable revulsion. But I did not faint. I did not scream. When the heaving finally subsided, I straightened up, wiped my mouth with the back of my trembling hand, and I met Dmitri's gaze. My eyes were no longer just angry or defiant. They were cold. They were hard. They were a reflection of the brutal, unforgiving world he had shown me. He had expected tears and pleas. He had gotten a chilling, silent resilience. And in that moment, I saw it, the definitive, undeniable shift in his perception of me. I was no longer just a pawn. I was no longer just a liability. I was something more, something dangerous, something he was undeniably, unwillingly, and irrevocably drawn to. That night, back at the mansion, the tension between us was a living, breathing thing, a third presence in the room. I confronted him in the library, the fire in the hearth casting flickering, demonic shadows on the walls. "What are you trying to turn me into?" I asked, my voice a low, steady thing, devoid of the hysterical fear he had expected. He stood by the fire, the flames reflecting in his cold, pale eyes. "I am not turning you into anything," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I am showing you the reality of the crown you now wear. A true queen cannot be afraid of the blood that buys her throne." The argument that followed was not one of tears and accusations. It was a fierce, charged debate, a battle of wills, of two sharp, analytical minds. It was a strange, twisted, and utterly intoxicating form of foreplay. It culminated not in a kiss, not in a touch, but in a moment of raw, intense, and undeniable connection. A moment where he saw the survivor in me, And I, to my own terror, saw the flicker of a man behind the monster. His curiosity about me was now fully, dangerously ignited. He was no longer just my jailer. He was intrigued by his prisoner, and in the dark, brutal, and unforgiving world of the Petrova Bratva, that was a far more dangerous thing to be. Part 4. Whispers of War. The aftermath of the execution at the dacha was not a return to the cold, hostile silence that had defined my first weeks in Moscow. It was something far more unnerving, a new, fragile, and utterly terrifying accord had been struck between Dmitri and me. A silent acknowledgement that I had not broken under the weight of his brutal education. I had bent. I had been horrified. But I had endured. And in my endurance, a new, dangerous dynamic had been born. The house was no longer just a gilded cage. It was a chessboard. And I, who had been nothing more than a pawn, was beginning to understand the game. Dmitri's lessons continued, but their nature shifted. He no longer treated me as a fragile, ignorant American girl who needed to be shocked into submission. He began to treat me as an apprentice, a reluctant but intelligent student of his dark and brutal world. He would bring me files, not of past atrocities, but of current operation shipping manifests, financial reports, surveillance logs. He would spread them out on the massive, polished mahogany desk in the library, and he would explain them to me. His voice a low, gravelly rumble, his explanations a cold, precise, and utterly fascinating lecture on the mechanics of a criminal empire. I listened. I learned. I absorbed the information with the same focused, analytical intensity I had once applied to my historical texts. I learned the coded language of his world, the subtle nuances of a business deal that was really a threat, the hidden meanings in a financial transaction that was really an act of war. Our evenings in the library became a strange, almost surreal ritual. We would sit on opposite sides of the massive desk. The only light the green glow of a banker's lamp. The only sound the soft rustle of paper and the low, steady cadence of his voice. It was a strange, almost academic intimacy. A meeting of two sharp, analytical minds in the heart of a dark and violent world. The tension between us was a constant, humming thing. A live wire that stretched across the polished expanse of the desk. It was no longer just the raw, physical tension of our first, brutal kiss. It was something more complex, more dangerous. It was the tension of two predators circling each other, a mixture of distrust, a grudging respect, and a dark, undeniable, and utterly terrifying curiosity. I began to see the man behind the monster, the strategist behind the brute. I saw the sharp, incisive intelligence in his eyes as he explained a complex financial scheme. I saw the cold, ruthless pragmatism that guided his every decision. He was not a mindless thug. He was a king, a brilliant, brutal, and utterly captivating one. And he, in turn, began to see me. He saw the quick, analytical mind behind my quiet, reserved demeanor. He saw the historian's ability to see patterns in chaos, to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent narrative. He would ask for my opinion, his pale, chilling eyes holding a new, strange intensity as he listened to my analysis. "You think like your father?" he said one night, his voice a low, almost thoughtful murmur. It was the first time he had mentioned my father in a way that was not a cold, dismissive statement of fact. "I never knew my father," I retorted, my voice a cool, steady thing, not the real one. Anyway, he looked at me then, His gaze a sharp, piercing thing that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed walls of my composure. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low, almost gentle rumble. "You are more like him than you know." The words were a strange, unsettling, and oddly comforting thing. They were an acknowledgement, a validation, a thread of connection to a past I was only just beginning to understand. But the fragile, almost academic peace of our new routine was shattered by a whisper from the outside world. A whisper that reminded me that this was not a game, not a scholarly exercise. This was a war. And I was not just a student, I was a target. It began with a small, innocuous detail, a single discordant note in the otherwise perfect, brutal symphony of Dmitri's world, a shipment of weapons, a routine, low-level transaction, went missing. It was a minor loss, a nuisance, but the way it happened, the clean, almost surgical precision of the theft, was unsettling. It spoke of inside knowledge. It spoke of a new, more intelligent enemy. Then came the second whisper. A key political contact, a man who had been on the Petrova payroll for years, was found dead in his apartment. An apparent suicide. But the details didn't add up. It was too neat, too clean. It was a message. I was the one who found the connection. I was in the library, poring over the old Petrova family archives, the leather-bound ledgers that detailed a century of blood and business. I was looking for something, anything, that would give me a better understanding of the world I now inhabited. And I found it. A faded, almost forgotten entry from my grandfather's time, detailing a brief, bloody, and ultimately disastrous alliance with a rival family, the Chekhovs, the same name Orlov had mentioned on that first terrible day. The historical records were a dry, emotionless account of a business deal gone wrong, a betrayal, and a brutal, bloody retaliation. But as I read, a cold, prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. The details of the old conflict, the tactics, the strategies, the subtle, psychological warfare. They were a mirror image of what was happening now. The missing shipment, the suicide. They were not random acts of aggression. They were moves in a game, a long, patient, and deadly game of chess. I took my findings to Dmitri. I found him in his office, a stark, modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of his dark kingdom. He was standing by the window, staring out at the gray, snow-dusted city, his back to me. I laid the old, leather-bound ledger on his desk, my finger tracing the faded, spidery script of my grandfather's hand. "It's them," I said, my voice a low, steady thing. "The Chekhovs. This isn't a new war. It's an old one. And they're not just attacking your business. They're coming for the family. They're coming for me." He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter sky outside. He looked at the ledger, then at me. A long, silent moment stretched between us. A moment where I felt like I was being weighed, measured, and judged. "You are right," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He walked to the desk and stood beside me, his presence a solid, intimidating wall of heat and muscle. He looked down at the open ledger, his large, tattooed hand resting on the page beside my own. "This is not just business. This is personal." The admission was a subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. He was no longer just my teacher, my jailer. He was my protector. and I was no longer just his student, his prisoner. I was his partner, a reluctant, unwilling, and terrified partner, but a partner nonetheless. The whispers of war became a roar. The Chekhovs, emboldened by their initial successes, escalated their attacks. They were no longer content with subtle, strategic moves. They began a campaign of terror, a series of brutal, public displays of violence designed to destabilize Dmitri's power and spread fear throughout his organization. A car bomb exploded outside one of our nightclubs. A bloody, fiery message that killed 3 of Dmitri's men and a dozen innocent civilians. A key lieutenant was gunned down in broad daylight as he left his son's school. The attacks were a direct, brazen challenge to Dmitri's authority. A declaration of all-out war. The mansion, once a silent, oppressive prison, became a fortress, a war room. The air was thick with a new, more palpable tension, the low, humming vibration of a predator preparing for battle. Dmitri's men, the silent, black-clad soldiers who had once been my jailers, were now a constant, visible presence, their faces grim, their eyes hard and watchful. I was no longer confined to the library and my own wing. I was a fixture in Dmitri's office, a silent, observant presence at his war councils. I sat at the long, polished table with his sovetniki, the hard, older men who had once looked at me with such cold, dismissive contempt. They still looked at me with suspicion, but it was now mixed with a new, grudging respect. I was the one who had seen the historical pattern, the one who had predicted the Chekhov's strategy. I had earned my place at the table. The war was a brutal, bloody, and utterly terrifying thing, but in the heart of the chaos, in the crucible of shared danger, a strange, twisted, and undeniable intimacy began to grow between Dmitri and me. We were 2 soldiers in a foxhole, 2 survivors on a lifeboat, bound together by a common enemy and a shared, desperate will to survive. The final, devastating move in the Chekhov's gambit was not an attack on Dmitri's business, or his men. It was an attack on me. It was a quiet, insidious thing. A package arrived at the mansion. A simple brown cardboard box addressed to me. It was intercepted by security. Of course, scanned, X-rayed, and declared safe. It was delivered to my room by a grim-faced guard. Inside was a single object, a small, worn, leather-bound copy of Alice in Wonderland. My copy. The one my mother had read to me 1,000 times as a child. Its pages soft and thin with age, its margins filled with her delicate, spidery script. Tucked inside the pages was a single, stark white photograph. It was a picture of the front of my old apartment building in Boston, taken from across the street. There was a date stamp in the corner. It was from the day before. The message was clear, unambiguous, and utterly terrifying. We know who you were. We know where you came from. We can reach across the world and touch the things you love. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A cold, hard, and utterly unfamiliar calm settled over me. I walked to Dmitri's office, the book in my hand, and I placed it on his desk. He looked at it, then at me, his face a mask of stone, but I saw it, the raw, murderous fury that blazed in the depths of his cold, pale eyes. He did not speak. He simply rose from his chair, came to stand in front of me, and he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing. A silent, violent promise of protection. He held me for a long, Silent moment. His face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own. "They will not touch you," he whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing against my ear. "I will burn their world to the ground." That night, the fragile, unspoken truce between us was shattered. The shared danger, the constant, simmering tension, the raw, undeniable intimacy of our strange, twisted partnership, it all culminated in a single, explosive, and utterly inevitable event. He came to my room, a dark, silent figure in the moonlit darkness. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air was thick with a raw, desperate, and undeniable need. It was not a gentle, tender coming together. It was a collision, a violent, possessive, and utterly devastating claiming. It was a raw, brutal, and beautiful thing. A desperate, frantic attempt to find a moment of life in the heart of a world of death, in the aftermath. As we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the sound of our ragged breaths the only sound in the silent room, he turned to me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim light. "You are mine, Anya," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive thing. "You are mine to protect. You are mine to keep. You are mine." And as I looked into the eyes of this cold, brutal, and beautiful monster, this king of a dark and violent world, this man who was my husband, my jailer, my protector, I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that he was right, I was his, and in the heart of the war, in the crucible of blood and fear, I had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered. Part 5. A Truce in the Dark. The photograph was a declaration of war, not against the Petrova bratva, but against me. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply personal threat, a message sent across an ocean to remind me that no wall was high enough, no guard loyal enough, to protect me from the long, vengeful reach of my enemies. The Chekhovs had not just invaded my present, they had desecrated my past, turning a cherished memory, a symbol of my mother's love, into a harbinger of death. The cold, hard calm that had settled over me in the first moments after the discovery was a fragile, brittle thing. It was the calm of a frozen lake, its surface smooth and placid, but its depths churning with a dark, violent current of terror and a new, unfamiliar emotion, a hot, searing, and profound rage. They had threatened me. They had used my mother's memory as a weapon. And in doing so, they had made a fatal mistake. They had given their enemy a face. My face. Dmitri's promise to burn their world to the ground was not a comfort. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, and deeply seductive thing. His embrace, that hard, bruising, and utterly desperate claiming, was not a violation. It was an anchor in a storm, a silent, violent promise of protection that I, to my own shame and terror, found myself clinging to with a desperate, drowning strength. The days that followed were a study in controlled, simmering paranoia. The mansion, once a silent, oppressive prison, became a fortress on high alert. The number of guards doubled. Silent, black-clad figures with the dead eyes of sharks patrolled the perimeter, their presence a constant, visible reminder of the invisible threat that now surrounded us. The house was no longer just a gilded cage, it was a bunker, a war room, the air thick with the low, humming vibration of a predator preparing for battle. Dmitri was a ghost of a different sort now. He did not leave. He remained in the mansion, a dark, brooding, and utterly terrifying presence. He was a caged tiger, his raw, violent energy contained within the cold, sterile walls of his office, but I could feel it, a palpable, dangerous thing that seemed to make the very air in the house crackle with tension. He was a creature of the night, and he drew me into his darkness. Our nights were a blur of whiskey, old maps, and the low, gravelly murmur of his voice as he explained the intricate, bloody tapestry of his world. We would sit in his office, the only light the green glow of a banker's lamp, the city of Moscow a glittering, indifferent carpet of lights outside the vast, bulletproof window. He was teaching me, arming me, not just with knowledge, but with his own cold, ruthless pragmatism, our physical relationship, the raw, explosive thing that had been born in the crucible of his brutal education was now a constant, simmering heat beneath the surface of our strange, strategic partnership. The memory of his mouth on mine, of his body against mine, was a ghost that haunted the charged, silent spaces between us. We did not speak of it, we did not acknowledge it, but it was there, a live wire that hummed with a dangerous, unspoken promise. The attack came on a Tuesday. It was a cold, clear night. The sky a vast, inky canvas pricked with the sharp, distant light of a million stars. The snow on the ground was a clean, white, and deceptively peaceful blanket. I was in the library, a fire roaring in the hearth, a thick, leather-bound volume of Russian folklore open on my lap. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft, rhythmic crackle of the fire and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of the mansion's security systems. It was a sound, or rather, a lack of one. That alerted me. The low, steady hum of the security system. A sound I had grown so accustomed to it had become a part of the house's silence. Suddenly, abruptly, cut out. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a dead, heavy, and utterly terrifying thing. I froze, the book in my lap forgotten, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I listened, my ears straining in the sudden, absolute stillness, and then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scrape from the direction of the French doors, though my eyes fixed on the sliver of darkness where the heavy velvet curtains did not quite meet. The doors swung open with a soft, almost gentle whoosh. Two figures, dressed in black from head to toe, their faces obscured by ski masks, slipped into the room. They moved with a silent, fluid grace, their movements the economical, practiced motions of professionals. They were not common thugs. They were killers. My heart was a cold, hard knot of terror in my chest, but my mind was surprisingly, terrifyingly clear. I did not think of my own death. I thought of Dmitri. He was in his office, at the other end of the vast, sprawling mansion. He would not know. He would not hear. One of the men saw me, his eyes, too cold, dark holes in the black fabric of his mask, widened slightly in surprise. He raised a hand, a silent command to his partner, and he started to move toward me, a silenced pistol in his hand. I did not have a weapon. I did not have a plan. I had only the desperate, primal instinct to survive. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a solid brass poker from the fireplace, and I hurled it at him. It was a clumsy, desperate, and utterly futile gesture. He sidestepped it with an easy, almost contemptuous grace, the poker clattering harmlessly to the marble floor. He was in front of me now, so close I could smell the cold, metallic scent of his gun, the faint, sour smell of his sweat. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his grip a band of iron. And then the world exploded. It was not a sound that I heard, but a force that I felt. A sudden, violent concussion that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The man holding me was thrown backward, a look of shocked, uncomprehending surprise on his face. A small, dark, and perfectly round hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The second man spun around, his own weapon raised. But he was too slow. A dark shape descended from the shadows of the library's upper gallery, a silent, avenging angel of death. Dmitri. He moved with a speed and a brutality that was almost inhuman. It was not a fight. It was an execution, a blur of motion, a flash of steel, a series of short, sharp, and sickeningly wet sounds. It was over in seconds. The second man lay on the floor, his throat a gaping, bloody wound. The silence that followed was a ringing, deafening thing, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Dmitri stood over the two dead men, his chest heaving, a thin, elegant stiletto clutched in his hand, its blade dripping with a dark, viscous liquid. He was not the cold, controlled czar of the boardroom. He was not the reluctant, almost gentle lover of our stolen nights. He was a killer, a predator, a creature of pure, unadulterated violence. He turned to look at me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim, fire-lit room. He was breathing hard, his body a taut, coiled spring of adrenaline and a raw, murderous fury. He stalked toward me, and for a moment, I was afraid of him, of the raw, untamed violence that radiated from him in palpable waves. He stopped in front of me, his gaze sweeping over me, a frantic, desperate search for injury. He reached out, his hand, the one that was not holding the bloody knife, and he cut my face, his fingers a trembling, almost reverent cage around my jaw. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a raw, ragged thing, stripped of its usual cold control. I shook my head, my own body trembling with the violent, shuddering aftermath of the attack. No. A sound. A raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated relief tore from his throat. And then he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing. A silent, violent promise of protection. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own, the shared danger, the constant, simmering tension, the raw, undeniable intimacy of our strange, twisted partnership. It all culminated in that moment. The fragile, unspoken truce between us was shattered, and in its place, something new, something raw, something terrifyingly real, was born. He broke the embrace and looked down at me, his eyes a dark, stormy sea of 100 unreadable emotions, and then he kissed me. It was not a kiss of possession. It was not a kiss of comfort. It was a kiss of pure, unadulterated desperation, a kiss that said, "I almost lost you," a kiss that was a raw, primal, and utterly selfish claiming. I kissed him back, my own desperation matching his, a raw, hungry need for the life, the heat, the brutal, beautiful reality of him. I clung to him, my body arching against his, my hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. He lifted me in his arms as if I weighed nothing and carried me from the library, from the room that now smelled of death and cordite, leaving the two dead men behind for his silent, efficient cleaners to deal with. He carried me to his own suite, a vast masculine space of dark wood and black leather, and he laid me on his bed, the sheets cool and crisp against my heated skin. The night that followed was not a night of gentle, tender lovemaking. It was a storm, a tempest, a violent, beautiful, and utterly devastating claiming. It was a raw, brutal, and beautiful thing, a desperate, frantic attempt to find a moment of life in the heart of a world of death. It was a fusion of two souls, a forging of a new, unbreakable, and utterly terrifying bond. In the aftermath, as we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the first light of a gray, Russian dawn creeping through the vast, uncurtained window, he turned to me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim light. "You are mine, Anya," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive thing. "You are mine to protect. You are mine to keep. You are mine." And as I looked into the eyes of this cold, brutal, and beautiful monster, this king of a dark and violent world, this man who was my husband, my jailer, my protector, my lover, I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that he was right, I was his. And in the heart of the war, in the crucible of blood and fear, I had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered. Our truce was no longer one of strategy. It was a truce of the soul, a dark and binding pact sealed in blood and desire. Part 6. The Queen's Gambit. The aftermath of the attack was not a return to the cold, hostile silence that had defined my first weeks in Moscow. It was something far more unnerving, a new, fragile, and utterly terrifying accord had been struck between Dmitri and me. A silent acknowledgement that I had not broken under the weight of his brutal education. I had bent. I had been horrified, but I had endured. And in my endurance, a new, dangerous dynamic had been born. The house was no longer just a gilded cage, it was a chessboard. And I, who had been nothing more than a pawn, was beginning to understand the game. Dmitri's lessons continued, but their nature shifted. He no longer treated me as a fragile, ignorant American girl who needed to be shocked into submission. He began to treat me as an apprentice, a reluctant but intelligent student of his dark and brutal world. He would bring me files, not of past atrocities, but of current operations shipping manifests, financial reports, surveillance logs. He would spread them out on the massive, polished mahogany desk in the library, and he would explain them to me. His voice a low, gravelly rumble, his explanations a cold, precise, and utterly fascinating lecture on the mechanics of a criminal empire. I listened. I learned. I absorbed the information with the same focused, analytical intensity I had once applied to my historical texts. I learned the coded language of his world, the subtle nuances of a business deal that was really a threat, the hidden meanings in a financial transaction that was really an act of war. Our evenings in the library became a strange, almost surreal ritual. We would sit on opposite sides of the massive desk, the only light the green glow of a banker's lamp, the only sound the soft rustle of paper and the low, steady cadence of his voice. It was a strange, almost academic intimacy, a meeting of two sharp, analytical minds in the heart of a dark and violent world. The tension between us was a constant, humming thing, a live wire that stretched across the polished expanse of the desk. It was no longer just the raw, physical tension of our first, brutal kiss. It was something more complex, more dangerous. It was the tension of two predators circling each other, a mixture of distrust, a grudging respect, and a dark, undeniable, and utterly terrifying curiosity. I began to see the man behind the monster, the strategist behind the brute. I saw the sharp, incisive intelligence in his eyes as he explained a complex financial scheme. I saw the cold, ruthless pragmatism that guided his every decision. He was not a mindless thug. He was a king, a brilliant, brutal, and utterly captivating one, and he, in turn, began to see me. He saw the quick, analytical mind behind my quiet, reserved demeanor. He saw the historian's ability to see patterns in chaos, to connect disparate pieces of information into a coherent narrative. He would ask for my opinion, his pale, chilling eyes holding a new, strange intensity as he listened to my analysis. "You think like your father," he said one night, his voice a low, almost thoughtful murmur. It was the first time he had mentioned my father in a way that was not a cold, dismissive statement of fact. "I never knew my father," I retorted, my voice a cool, steady thing, not the real one. Anyway, he looked at me then, his gaze a sharp, piercing thing that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed walls of my composure. "Perhaps," he said, his voice a low, almost gentle rumble, "you are more like him than you know." The words were a strange, unsettling, and oddly comforting thing. They were an acknowledgement, a validation, a thread of connection to a past I was only just beginning to understand. But the fragile, almost academic piece of our new routine was shattered by a whisper from the outside world, a whisper that reminded me that this was not a game, not a scholarly exercise. This was a war, and I was not just a student, I was a target. It began with a small, innocuous detail, a single discordant note in the otherwise perfect, brutal symphony of Dmitri's world, a shipment of weapons, a routine, low-level transaction, went missing. It was a minor loss, a nuisance, but the way it happened, the clean, almost surgical precision of the theft, was unsettling. It spoke of inside knowledge. It spoke of a new, more intelligent enemy. Then came the second whisper, a key political contact. A man who had been on the Petrova payroll for years was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. But the details didn't add up. It was too neat, too clean. It was a message. I was the one who found the connection. I was in the library, poring over the old Petrova family archives, the leather-bound ledgers that detailed a century of blood and business. I was looking for something, anything, that would give me a better understanding of the world I now inhabited. And I found it. A faded, almost forgotten entry from my grandfather's time, detailing a brief, bloody, and ultimately disastrous alliance with a rival family, the Chekhovs, the same name Orlov had mentioned on that first terrible day. The historical records were a dry, emotionless account of a business deal gone wrong, a betrayal, and a brutal, bloody retaliation. But as I read, a cold, prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. The details of the old conflict, the tactics, the strategies, the subtle, psychological warfare, they were a mirror image of what was happening now. The missing shipment, the suicide. They were not random acts of aggression. They were moves in a game, a long, patient, and deadly game of chess. I took my findings to Dmitri. I found him in his office, a stark, modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of his dark kingdom. He was standing by the window, staring out at the gray, snow-dusted city, his back to me. I laid the old, leather-bound ledger on his desk, my finger tracing the faded, spidery script of my grandfather's hand. "It's them," I said, my voice a low, steady thing. "The Chekhovs. This isn't a new war. It's an old one. And they're not just attacking your business. They're coming for the family. They're coming for me." He turned slowly, his face a mask of stone, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter sky outside. He looked at the ledger, then at me. A long, silent moment stretched between us, a moment where I felt like I was being weighed, measured, and judged. "You are right," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He walked to the desk and stood beside me, his presence a solid, intimidating wall of heat and muscle. He looked down at the open ledger, his large, tattooed hand resting on the page beside my own. "This is not just business. This is personal." The admission was a subtle but significant shift in our dynamic. He was no longer just my teacher, my jailer. He was my protector. And I was no longer just his student, his prisoner. I was his partner, a reluctant, unwilling, and terrified partner, but a partner nonetheless. The whispers of war became a roar. The Chekhovs, emboldened by their initial successes, escalated their attacks. They were no longer content with subtle, strategic moves. They began a campaign of terror, a series of brutal, public displays of violence designed to destabilize Dmitri's power and spread fear throughout his organization. A car bomb exploded outside one of our nightclubs, a bloody, fiery message that killed 3 of Dmitri's men and a dozen innocent civilians. A key lieutenant was gunned down in broad daylight as he left his son's school. The attacks were a direct, brazen challenge to Dmitri's authority, a declaration of all-out war. The mansion, once a silent, oppressive prison, became a fortress, a war room. The air was thick with a new, more palpable tension, the low, humming vibration of a predator preparing for battle. Dmitri's men, the silent, black-clad soldiers who had once been my jailers, were now a constant, visible presence, their faces grim, their eyes hard and watchful. I was no longer confined to the library and my own wing. I was a fixture in Dmitri's office, a silent, observant presence at his war councils. I sat at the long, polished table with his Sovetniki, the hard, older men who had once looked at me with such cold, dismissive contempt. They still looked at me with suspicion, but it was now mixed with a new, grudging respect. I was the one who had seen the historical pattern, the one who had predicted the Chekhov strategy. I had earned my place at the table. The war was a brutal, bloody, and utterly terrifying thing. But in the heart of the chaos, in the crucible of shared danger, a strange, twisted, and undeniable intimacy began to grow between Dmitri and me. We were 2 soldiers in a foxhole, 2 survivors on a lifeboat, bound together by a common enemy and a shared, desperate will to survive. The final, devastating move in the Chekhov's gambit was not an attack on Dmitri's business or his men. It was an attack on me. It was a quiet, insidious thing. A package arrived at the mansion. A simple, brown cardboard box addressed to me. It was intercepted by security. Of course, scanned, X-rayed, and declared safe. It was delivered to my room by a grim-faced guard. Inside was a single object, a small, worn, leather-bound copy of Alice in Wonderland. My copy. the one my mother had read to me 1,000 times as a child. Its pages soft and thin with age, its margins filled with her delicate, spidery script. Tucked inside the pages was a single, stark white photograph. It was a picture of the front of my old apartment building in Boston, taken from across the street. There was a date stamp in the corner. It was from the day before. The message was clear, unambiguous, and utterly terrifying. We know who you were. We know where you came from. We can reach across the world and touch the things you love. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A cold, hard, and utterly unfamiliar calm settled over me. I walked to Dmitri's office, the book in my hand, and I placed it on his desk. He looked at it, then at me. His face a mask of stone, but I saw it. The raw, murderous fury that blazed in the depths of his cold, pale eyes. He did not speak. He simply rose from his chair, came to stand in front of me, and he pulled me into his arms. His embrace was not gentle. It was a hard, bruising, and utterly desperate thing, a silent, violent promise of protection. He held me for a long, silent moment, his face buried in my hair, his body a solid, unyielding wall of muscle against my own. "They will not touch you," he whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing against my ear. "I will burn their world to the ground." That night, the fragile, unspoken truce between us was shattered. The shared danger, the constant, simmering tension, the raw, undeniable intimacy of our strange, twisted partnership, it all culminated in a single, explosive, and utterly inevitable event. He came to my room, a dark, silent figure in the moonlit darkness. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air was thick with a raw, desperate, and undeniable need. It was not a gentle, tender coming together. It was a collision, a violent, possessive, and utterly devastating claiming. It was a raw, brutal, and beautiful thing. A desperate, frantic attempt to find a moment of life in the heart of a world of death. In the aftermath, as we lay tangled in the sheets, our bodies slick with sweat, the sound of our ragged breaths the only sound in the silent room, he turned to me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim light. "You are mine, Anya," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive thing. "You are mine to protect. You are mine to keep. You are mine." And as I looked into the eyes of this cold, brutal, and beautiful monster, this king of a dark and violent world, this man who was my husband, my jailer, my protector, I knew, with a terrifying, soul-shattering certainty, that he was right, I was his, and in the heart of the war, in the crucible of blood and fear, I had finally, irrevocably, and utterly surrendered. Part 7. The Ghost in the Organization. The war for Moscow was not fought in the open. It was a thing of shadows and whispers, a silent, deadly chess match played out in the frozen, glittering streets of the city and the dark, smoke-filled corners of its underworld. The Chekhovs were a hydra, a multi-headed beast. For every smuggling route we crippled, they opened another. For every political contact we neutralized, they bought another. They were a cancer, spreading through the city's arteries, and our victories felt small, temporary, like cutting back a weed only to have it grow back stronger, more virulent. Our life, Dmitri's and mine, settled into a strange, brutal, and almost domestic rhythm. Our days were a study in controlled, focused violence. We were a two-person war council. our world shrinking to the confines of his office. A stark, modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of a dark kingdom. We would spend hours poring over financial records that were written in a language of blood and money, surveillance reports that were a testament to the city's secret sins, and maps of Moscow that were not just geographical documents, but strategic battle plans. Our nights were a different kind of war, a different kind of strategy. They were a desperate, frantic, and beautiful thing. A temporary truce in the larger battle for our lives. We would come together in the darkness, two damaged, lonely souls, and in the raw, brutal honesty of our physical connection. We would find a strange, fleeting kind of peace. He would touch me with a reverence that was at odds with the killer he was. His hands, one smooth and perfect, the other a canvas of dark, violent ink, mapping my body as if it were a new, undiscovered country. And I, in turn, would cling to him. My body a willing surrender, my heart a traitorous, fluttering thing in my chest. I was in love with him. The realization was no longer a terrifying, shocking thing. It was a simple, undeniable fact, a part of the new, strange, and brutal landscape of my life. I was in love with a monster, a killer, a king of a dark and violent world, and in the quiet, secret corners of my own heart, I was beginning to realize that I was no longer just his captive. I was his queen, but the war was taking its toll, the constant threat, the paranoia, the ever-present shadow of death. It was a corrosive, grinding thing. And the most dangerous part of it was the ghost in our own organization, the traitor, the one who had helped the Chekhovs assassinate my parents, the one who was now, we were certain, feeding them information, helping them anticipate our every move. The hunt for the ghost became our obsession. It was a cancer within the Petrova bratva, a poison that was slowly, silently killing us from the inside. We trusted no one. Our world shrank until it was just the two of us, two against a world of enemies, both seen and unseen. The traitor was clever. He was a ghost, leaving no tracks, no evidence, only the faint, chilling scent of his betrayal in the aftermath of every failed operation, every compromised asset. The paranoia in the mansion was a thick, suffocating fog. Dmitri's men, the hard, loyal soldiers who had once been my jailers, now looked at each other with a new, wary suspicion. The trust that was the bedrock of the bratva was crumbling, and that, I knew, was the ghost's true weapon. "He's not just a traitor," I said one night, my voice a low, thoughtful thing in the quiet of Dmitri's office. We were staring at a large, detailed map of the city, the known territories of the Chekhovs marked in a stark, blood red. "He's a saboteur. He's not just feeding them information, he's actively working to dismantle us from within. He's creating chaos, sowing dissent. He's trying to start a civil war." Dmitri looked at me, his pale, chilling eyes holding a new, strange intensity. "You see it, too," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the strange, almost telepathic connection that had grown between us. "He's a historian," I said, a sudden, chilling realization dawning on me. "He's using the old tactics, the ones my grandfather wrote about in his ledgers. He's not just a soldier, he's a strategist, and he knows our history as well as I do." The realization was a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. Our enemy was not just a man with a gun. He was a man with a mind that was a dark, twisted mirror of my own. The hunt for the ghost became a personal, intellectual battle. I spent my days in the library, the old, leather-bound ledgers of my family's history, my only companions. I was not just reading them now, I was studying them, dissecting them, searching for a clue, a pattern, a ghost of a ghost. And then, I found it. A small, almost insignificant detail. A single discordant note in the otherwise perfect, brutal symphony of my family's history. A name. A man who had been my grandfather's closest friend and advisor. A man who had been exiled after a failed power play. A man who was supposed to be dead. But the records of his death were ambiguous, incomplete. It was a loose thread, a single, tantalizing clue in a cold, decades-old case. I took my findings to Dmitri. He listened, his face a mask of stone, his eyes never leaving mine. When I was finished, he was silent for a long, pregnant moment. "It is not possible," he said, his voice a flat, dismissive thing. "The man is dead." "Is he?" I challenged. My own voice a quiet, steady counterpoint to his certainty. Or is that just what my grandfather wanted everyone to believe? The seed of doubt had been planted. I saw it in the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, in the way his jaw tightened. The war with the Chekhovs reached a bloody, violent crescendo. They were growing bolder, more desperate. They knew we were closing in on them, on their ghost. They made a final, desperate move. They targeted not me, not Dmitri, but the one thing he valued more than his own life, his past. A package arrived at the mansion. It was not a bomb. It was something far more cruel, far more personal. It was a small, wooden box, intricately carved with the image of a Russian firebird. Inside, on a bed of black velvet, was a single object, a woman's silver locket, tarnished with age. I was in the office with Dmitri when Orlov brought it in. The moment Dmitri saw it, the blood drained from his face. The cold, controlled mask of the Pakhan, the Tsar, the monster, crumbled, leaving behind the raw, unguarded face of a man. He reached out, his hand trembling, and he took the locket. He opened it with a soft, almost reverent click. Inside were two small, faded photographs. One was of a beautiful, dark-haired woman with sad, soulful eyes. The other was of a small, dark-haired boy with a fierce, proud, and utterly heartbreaking smile. "Who is she?" I whispered. My voice a soft, gentle thing in the sudden, heavy silence of the room. He did not answer for a long, agonizing moment. He simply stared at the photograph, his face a mask of a grief so profound, so ancient. It stole the breath from my lungs. "She was my mother," he said finally, his voice a raw, broken thing I had never heard before. "And this was my brother." The story came out in a torrent, a flood of a pain he had kept locked away for a lifetime. His mother, a beautiful, tragic woman from a rival family, had been a casualty of the endless, bloody wars of the Bratva, and his brother, his younger brother, had been lost. A casualty of a different kind of war. A war of secrets and lies, and a betrayal so deep it had shattered his family and his soul. The locket was a message from the ghost, a cruel, intimate, and utterly devastating one. "I know your secrets. I know your weaknesses. I can touch the things you have buried. The grief that had been a shared, unspoken bond between us was now a raw, open wound." I went to him, my own heart aching with a pain that was a mirror of his own, and I wrapped my arms around him. He was a wall of ice and steel. But for the first time, he did not push me away. He leaned into me, his large, powerful body trembling with the force of a grief he had held inside for a lifetime. That night, the war with the Chekhovs, the hunt for the ghost, it all faded into the background. There was only us, two broken, damaged souls, finding a moment of solace, of healing, in each other's arms. Our lovemaking was not the wild, desperate, and almost violent thing it had been before. It was a slow, gentle, and almost reverent exploration, a silent, sacred vow in the heart of a dark and violent world. In the aftermath, as we lay tangled in the sheets, the first light of a gray, Russian dawn creeping through the window, he turned to me, his eyes, those pale, chilling eyes, now clear and steady and filled with a raw, terrifying vulnerability, the man my grandfather exiled. I said, my voice a soft, almost hesitant thing in the quiet of the room, the man who was supposed to be dead. His name was Ivan Chekhov. Dmitri's body went still. The connection was made. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The ghost was not just a traitor. He was a patriarch, the head of the Chekhov family, a man who had been nursing a grudge, a desire for vengeance, for decades. A man who was now using his own sons, his own family, as pawns in his long, patient, and deadly game of revenge against the Petrova family. The war was no longer just business. It was a blood feud, a legacy of hatred passed down from one generation to the next, and we were at the heart of it. The discovery of the ghost's identity was not a victory. It was a death sentence. It meant that the war would not end until one family, one bloodline, was completely, utterly, and irrevocably destroyed. I looked at the man beside me, at the king of this dark and brutal kingdom, at the monster I had fallen in love with. And I knew, with a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying certainty, that I would stand by his side until the very end. I was no longer just his queen. I was his soldier, and this was our war. Part 8, the first cut. The discovery of Ivan Chekhov's ghost was a lit match thrown into a room full of gasoline. The simmering, shadowy war that had been waged in the back alleys and boardrooms of Moscow exploded into a full-blown, open conflict. There were no more whispers, no more subtle threats. There was only the brutal, deafening roar of a blood feud reignited, a firestorm of violence that threatened to consume the entire city, our lives, which had found a strange, almost domestic rhythm at the heart of the storm, were now a chaotic, relentless blur of strategy and survival. Sleep was a luxury we could no longer afford. Food was a necessity we barely remembered. Our world shrank to the confines of Dmitri's office, a war room that smelled of stale coffee, expensive cigar smoke, and the sharp, metallic scent of fear. The man I had fallen in love with, the monster who had shown me the raw, vulnerable heart that beat beneath his armor of ice and steel, was gone. In his place was the Pakhan, the Tsar, the cold, ruthless, and utterly brilliant strategist who had built the Petrova Empire from the ashes of his own tragic past. He was a creature of pure, focused, and terrifyingly beautiful violence, and I, his queen, was his most devoted and most dangerous soldier. Our intimacy did not vanish in the crucible of the war. It transformed. It was no longer a thing of soft, stolen moments in the darkness. It was a raw, desperate, and almost violent thing, a frantic, selfish taking of comfort and release in the brief. Stolen lulls between battles. We were two soldiers on the front lines, and our love was a battlefield, a place of brutal honesty, of raw, unguarded vulnerability, of a shared, desperate will to survive. The war was not just a physical battle, it was a psychological one. Ivan Chekhov was a master of the game, a ghost who haunted our every move. He did not fight us with brute force alone. He fought us with our own history, with our own weaknesses. He sent us messages, not of threats, but of memories. A single, wilted flower left on my mother's grave. A rare, out-of-print book of poetry, the kind my father had loved, delivered to the mansion. Each one was a small, intimate, and utterly cruel reminder of the world we had lost. A poisoned dart aimed at the heart of our shared grief. But Ivan Chekhov had made a fatal miscalculation. He thought our grief was a weakness. He did not understand that Dmitri had forged his grief into a weapon, a shield, a suit of armor. And I was learning to do the same. The pain of my parents' death, of their lies, of my own lost innocence, it was no longer a source of weakness. It was a source of strength, a cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving fire that burned in the core of my being. The hunt for the ghost became a personal, intellectual battle between Ivan and me. He was a master of the old ways, of the brutal, straightforward tactics of my grandfather's time. But I was a student of a new kind of warfare, a warfare of information, of technology, of psychology. I used my historian's mind, my outsider's perspective, to deconstruct his strategies, to anticipate his moves. I was no longer just a player in the game. I was becoming a master of it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a low-level informant, a man who had been on the Petrova payroll for years, a man who was so insignificant he had been overlooked by both sides. He came to us with a piece of information, a single, tantalizing clue, the location of a secret meeting between Ivan Chekhov and his key lieutenants. It was a trap. We knew it was a trap. It was too easy, too convenient. Ivan was a master of deception. He was trying to lure us out, to draw us into a battle on his own terms. "We do not go," Dmitri said, his voice a flat, final thing. He stood in front of the large, detailed map of the city in his office, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of stone. "It is a suicide mission." "No," I said, my own voice a quiet, steady counterpoint to his certainty. I stood beside him, my eyes on the map, on the small red circle that marked the location of the meeting. "It is an opportunity." The argument that followed was not one of tears and pleas. It was a fierce, charged debate, a battle of wills, of two sharp analytical minds. He saw the risk. I saw the opening. He saw the trap. I saw the bait. "He is expecting you to come in with force," I said, my voice a low, intense thing. "He is expecting the Pakhan, the Tsar, the monster. He is not expecting the queen." The plan I proposed was audacious, reckless, and utterly insane. I would go to the meeting, alone, unarmed. I would be the bait. I would be the distraction. And while Ivan Chekhov was focused on me, on the soft, American girl he so clearly underestimated, Dmitri and his men would strike, a swift, silent, and utterly devastating blow. Dmitri's refusal was a cold, hard, and absolute thing. "No," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "I will not risk you. You are not risking me. I retorted, my own voice a sharp, defiant thing. You are trusting me. You are trusting your queen. The argument raged for hours. It was not just about strategy. It was about us. It was about his need to protect me and my need to prove myself. It was about his fear of losing me and my refusal to be a prisoner, a protected, and ultimately, a powerless thing. In the end, I won. Not through logic, not through strategy, but through a raw, emotional, and utterly honest plea. I stood before him, my hands on his chest, my eyes holding his, and I laid my soul bare. I told him that I loved him, that I would die for him, but that I would not live as his weakness. I would be his partner, his equal, his queen, or I would be nothing. The look in his eyes as he finally, reluctantly, agreed was a mixture of a raw, terrifying fear and a fierce, proud, and utterly devastating love. The night of the meeting was a cold, clear, and starless night. I was dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, my hair pulled back in a severe, tight knot at the nape of my neck. I wore no jewelry, no makeup. I was a ghost, a shadow, a queen going to war. Dmitri stood before me in the grand, echoing foyer of the mansion. He did not speak. He simply reached out and cupped my face, his hands a cage of terrifying gentleness. He leaned in and kissed me, a slow, deep, and utterly desperate kiss that was a prayer, a promise, and a goodbye. Come back to me, Jaina, he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing against my lips. Always, I promised. The meeting was in a vast, abandoned cathedral on the outskirts of the city. Its stained glass windows shattered, its stone walls crumbling. It was a fitting stage for a final, bloody act. Ivan Chekhov was waiting for me. He was an old man, his face a roadmap of a long, hard, and bitter life. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a cold, reptilian cunning. He was not a monster of brute force, like Dmitri. He was a monster of the mind, a creature of patience, of strategy, of a slow, corrosive, and utterly consuming hatred. He had underestimated me. He had expected a frightened, hysterical girl. He had not expected the cold, calm, and utterly composed woman who walked into his trap. We spoke for what felt like an eternity. It was a verbal chess match, a duel of wits, of two sharp, analytical minds. He spoke of the past, of his betrayal by my grandfather, of his long, patient quest for vengeance. I spoke of the future, of a new order, of a Petrova empire that was stronger, more ruthless, and more intelligent than ever before. And then, the trap was sprung. But it was not his trap. It was mine. The sound of the first explosion was a deafening, earth-shattering roar that shook the very foundations of the old cathedral. Chaos erupted. Ivan's men, who had been hidden in the shadows, were thrown into a state of panicked confusion. And in the heart of the chaos, Dmitri and his men descended, a silent, avenging army of ghosts. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly decisive. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. When the dust settled, the silence in the old, ruined cathedral was absolute. Ivan Chekhov was on his knees in the center of the nave, his face a mask of shocked, uncomprehending defeat. He was surrounded by the bodies of his men, his sons, his entire empire, a kingdom of ashes at his feet. Dmitri stood before him, a dark, imposing figure against the shattered, moonlit, stained glass window. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes as cold and hard as the winter sky. This was the moment of judgment, the moment of vengeance, the moment that would define the future of the Petrova bratva. But Dmitri did not kill him. He turned to me, his eyes holding a new, strange, and utterly terrifying question. "He is yours, Zhena," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that echoed in the vast, silent space. "He is your blood, your legacy, your justice." He was giving me a choice, a terrible, brutal, and utterly necessary choice. He was forcing me to cross the final, bloody line. He was forcing me to become the queen he needed me to be. I walked toward Ivan Chekhov, my heels clicking a sharp, decisive rhythm on the stone floor. I took the gun from Dmitri's outstretched hand. It was heavy, cold, and felt strangely, terrifyingly natural in my hand. I stood before the old man, the architect of my parents' death, the ghost who had haunted my life. He looked up at me, his eyes filled not with fear, but with a strange, almost curious respect. "You are your father's daughter. After all," he whispered, his voice a dry, rustling thing. "No," I said, my own voice a cold, steady thing I didn't recognize as my own. "I am my mother's." And then I pulled the trigger. The sound of the single gunshot was a sharp, clean, and utterly final crack in the frozen silence. It was the sound of my old life ending, and my new one beginning. It was the sound of a princess dying, and a queen being born. It was the first, brutal, and beautiful note in the new, dark, and terrifying symphony of my life. Part 9. War of Ashes. We were no longer just lovers, bound by a dark and desperate passion. We were partners, a dangerous, volatile alliance forged in the crucible of betrayal and a love that defied all logic. The final confrontation was no longer just Dmitri's war for the soul of the Petrova bratva. It was ours. The ghost, Ivan Chekhov, had been unmasked. His long, patient game of revenge laid bare, but the traitor who had been his instrument, the man who had helped him orchestrate my parents' murder, was still a shadow in our midst, a cancer that we had yet to cut out. The war for Moscow was a silent, deadly thing. A chess match played out on a board of frozen streets and glittering, indifferent skyscrapers, the Chekhovs, with their patriarch's ghost finally revealed, were no longer a subtle, insidious threat. They were a wounded, cornered animal, and that made them all the more dangerous. Dmitri's world, once a place of fear and mystery, became my own. I sat in on his war councils, my presence a silent, accepted, and utterly terrifying reality to his hardened, loyal men. They were men with faces like maps of hard roads, their eyes holding the cold, flat look of those who have seen too much. The initial suspicion and contempt they had held for me had been burned away in the fires of the past few weeks, replaced by a new, grudging, and almost fearful respect. I was no longer the soft, American girl, the decorative, ornamental wife. I was the woman who had seen the patterns in the chaos, the woman who had unmasked the ghost. I was the Pakhan's Zhena, his queen, and in their world, that title, earned not by blood but by fire, carried its own weight, its own power. I was not a strategist, not a killer, not in the way they were, but I had my own weapons. I had my mind, my intuition, and my unique, intimate understanding of the man they all feared. I saw the patterns in the Chekhov's movements, the subtle dissonances in their plans that hinted at a growing desperation. I became Dmitri's most trusted advisor, his secret weapon, his shadow queen. The final move was my idea. It was audacious, reckless, and theatrical. It was a plan born of a historian's soul, a strategy that drew its inspiration not from the brutal, straightforward tactics of the Bratva, but from the subtle, psychological warfare of the ancient world. The Chekhovs, in a brazen, almost arrogant display of their feigned legitimacy, were hosting their annual charity gala at the Bolshoi Theater. It was the jewel in the crown of Moscow's social calendar, a night of champagne, couture, and carefully constructed lies. It was the perfect stage for a final performance. "It is a trap," Dmitri said, his voice a low, dark rumble as we stood in his office. A blueprint of the theater spread out on the massive glass and steel desk between us. The city lights glittered outside the vast, panoramic window. A cold, indifferent sea of diamonds. "I know," I replied, my voice steady, my finger tracing the lines of the grand stage. "That is why it will work. They will be expecting you to come in with force. They will have every exit covered, every corner guarded. They will not be expecting me." The plan was a high-stakes gambit, a queen's gambit. I would be the Trojan horse. I had been invited to the gala, a special guest of honor, the long-lost Petrova heir, making her first, tragic, and beautiful appearance in Moscow society. I would be the distraction, the beautiful, grieving bird in a gilded cage, singing her heart out while Dmitri and his men moved into position, dismantling the Chekhov empire from the inside out. The days leading up to the gala were a blur of a tense, fragile intimacy. We trained together, not just on the intricate, split-second timing of the plan, but on something more primal. He took me to the mansion's state-of-the-art gym, a cold, sterile room of steel and glass, and he taught me how to fight. He taught me basic self-defense, how to use my body as a weapon, how to find an opponent's weaknesses, how to kill. Our training sessions were charged with a dangerous, erotic energy. His body would be pressed against mine, his hands guiding my movements, his voice a low, rough murmur in my ear. He was teaching me to survive, and, in the process, he was branding me, marking me as his. These moments were a strange, twisted form of lovemaking, a violent, intimate dance of two predators. His fear for my safety was a palpable thing, a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of his cold, controlled demeanor. It clashed with his ruthless, unyielding need to win this war, to finally, irrevocably, put the ghosts of his past to rest. The night of the gala. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of a storm about to break. I stood in the grand, echoing foyer of the mansion, a stranger in my own skin. I was dressed in a gown of blood-red silk, a stark, defiant statement against the cold, white landscape of the Russian winter. The dress was a second skin, a suit of armor, a declaration of war. Dmitri stood before me, a dark, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was a creature of breathtaking, brutal beauty, a fallen angel in a world of monsters. His hand rested on the small of my back, a warm, grounding pressure. "It is not too late to walk away," he said. His voice a low murmur meant only for me, his breath a warm caress against my ear. I looked at him, at the raw, undisguised fear for me in his eyes, and my own fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "I am not the one who runs, Dmitri," I said softly. I rose on my toes and kissed him, a slow, lingering kiss that was a promise, A vow, a final, silent declaration of my allegiance. The Bolshoi Theater was a glittering, decadent jewel box, a world of red velvet, gilded balconies, and the soft, intoxicating scent of expensive perfume and old money. It was a world of beautiful lies, and tonight, it would be the stage for a brutal, bloody truth. I saw them from across the grand, crowded ballroom, the Chekhovs, Ivan, the old reptilian patriarch, his eyes sharp and intelligent and filled with a cold, ancient hatred, and beside him, his sons, his lieutenants, his army of well-dressed civilized monsters. And then, I saw the ghost, the traitor. He was standing beside Ivan, a trusted advisor, a loyal soldier. It was Victor, the man with the face like a clenched fist and the dead eyes of a killer. The man who had looked at me with such cold, undisguised contempt on my first night in this new, brutal world. The man who had been at my father's side for 20 years. The betrayal was a cold, sharp knife in the gut, but it was not a surprise. I had known, on some deep, intuitive level, that it was him. He was the dissonant note in the symphony, the one that had always felt wrong. I moved through the crowded ballroom, a ghost in red silk, my every move a carefully choreographed performance. I smiled. I nodded. I played the part of the tragic, beautiful, and utterly harmless Petrova heir, and all the while, I was aware of Dmitri and his men, silent, invisible ghosts moving into position, a web of violence and death closing in around our enemies. The climax of the evening was my speech. I was to stand on the grand, sweeping staircase and say a few words, a tribute to my parents, a promise to continue their philanthropic work. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly cynical piece of theater. I stood on the staircase, a single, blood-red figure against the white marble, the eyes of Moscow's elite upon me. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the glittering, anonymous crowd, at the smug, self-satisfied faces of the Chekhovs, at the cold, dead eyes of Victor. I did not speak of charity. I did not speak of philanthropy. I spoke of history. I spoke of betrayal. I spoke of a blood feud that had spanned generations. I spoke of a ghost who had returned from the dead to claim a final, bloody vengeance. My voice was a clear, cold, and utterly unforgiving thing in the sudden, shocked silence of the grand ballroom. It was not a speech. It was a declaration of war. It was a death sentence. The first gunshot was a sharp, percussive crack that shattered the crystal champagne flute in a woman's hand, a single, violent note of reality in the beautiful, constructed illusion. Panic erupted. Screams filled the air. The symphony had reached its violent, inevitable climax. I did not move. I stood on the staircase, a still calm point in the heart of the chaos. And I watched as Dmitri's plan unfolded with a silent, brutal efficiency. His men, who had been disguised as waiters and security, moved with a deadly, focused grace. The exits were sealed. The trap was sprung. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly decisive. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. I saw Dmitri then, moving through the chaos like a dark, avenging angel. He was a conductor of a different sort now, his movements precise, economical, lethal. He was orchestrating the downfall of his enemies, and it was a terrifying, mesmerizing sight. Victor appeared at the bottom of the staircase, his face a mask of pale, sweaty desperation, a gun clutched in his shaking hand. He was trying to get to me, to take the queen and force a stalemate. But he never made it. A single, clean shot rang out from the gilded balcony above. Victor crumpled to the marble floor, a look of surprise on his face, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. The battle was over. The chaos subsided, replaced by a deafening, ringing silence, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Dmitri was at my side in an instant, his body a shield, his hand on my back a warm, grounding pressure. He did not speak. He did not need to. His eyes, those pale, chilling eyes, found mine across the carnage-strewn ballroom, and in them, I saw a fierce, proud, and utterly devastating love. Ivan Chekhov was still alive. He stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the bodies of his sons, his men, his entire empire, a kingdom of ashes at his feet. He was a king with no kingdom, a patriarch with no family. He was a ghost, a relic of a bygone era. He looked at me, his eyes filled not with hatred, but with a strange, almost curious respect. "You are your father's daughter? After all," he whispered, his voice a dry, rustling thing. "No," I said, my own voice a cold, steady thing I didn't recognize as my own. "I am my mother's." Dmitri did not kill him. He simply turned and walked away, leaving the old man to the tender mercies of the authorities. A fate. I knew. That was far worse than a quick, clean death. As we walked out of the Bolshoi theater, out of the carnage, out of the war, and into the cold, clean, and silent Moscow night, Dmitri's hand found mine, his fingers, strong and calloused and stained with the ink of his violent life, laced through my own. "It is over. Zhena," he whispered, his voice a raw, ragged thing against my ear. I looked at our joined hands, at the stark, beautiful contrast of his dark, tattooed skin against my own pale, unmarked flesh. I looked at the city glittering around us, a cold, beautiful, and utterly unforgiving kingdom. And I knew that he was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just the beginning. Part 10. The Tsarina and the Tsar. The fall of the House of Chekhov was not a quiet affair. It was a seismic event. A bloody, violent earthquake that sent shock waves through the foundations of Moscow's underworld. The newspapers called it the Bolshoi bloodbath, a night of unprecedented, theatrical violence that had not just crippled, but utterly annihilated one of the city's oldest and most powerful criminal families. They spoke of a new, ruthless, and invisible power that had risen from the ashes, a new czar who had claimed the city's throne with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. They spoke of the Petrova Bratva. They spoke of Dmitri Volkov. In the weeks that followed, Dmitri moved with a cold, surgical precision to consolidate his power. The power vacuum left by the Chekhovs was not just filled, it was absorbed, assimilated into the ever-expanding Petrova Empire. Rival factions that had been circling like vultures, hoping to pick at the scraps of the Chekhovs' fallen kingdom, were either brutally crushed or forced to bend the knee. Dmitri's reign, which had once been a regency, a stewardship of a dead man's throne, was now absolute, unquestioned. Our life was not one of peace. The world was still dangerous, the shadows still long and deep. But it was our world, the cold, sterile mansion. Once my prison, my gilded cage, began to transform. It was no longer just a house. It was a fortress, a palace, the command center of a dark and sprawling kingdom. I filled its silent, cavernous rooms with life, with warmth, with the ghost of a home I had once known. I had the heavy, oppressive velvet curtains replaced with lighter, softer fabrics. I filled the cold, empty vases with fresh flowers, their vibrant colors a small, defiant rebellion against the monochrome world of my new reality. The staff, who had once looked at me with a mixture of fear and contempt, now moved with a new, different kind of deference. The fear was still there, a low, humming undercurrent in the vast, silent house, but it was now mixed with something else, a deep, unwavering, and almost reverent loyalty. I was no longer the soft, American girl, the decorative, ornamental wife. I was the woman who had walked into the lion's den and emerged not just unscathed, but with the lion at her side. I was the Tsarina, and this was my court. Our days settled into a strange, brutal, and almost domestic rhythm. We were a two-person war council, our world shrinking to the confines of Dmitri's office, a stark, modern room of glass and steel that felt like the command center of our shared kingdom. We would spend hours poring over financial records that were written in a language of blood and money, surveillance reports that were a testament to the city's secret sins, and maps of Moscow that were not just geographical documents, but strategic battle plans. Our nights were a different kind of war, a different kind of strategy. They were a desperate, frantic, and beautiful thing, a temporary truce in the larger battle for our lives. We would come together in the darkness, two damaged, lonely souls, and in the raw, brutal honesty of our physical connection, we would find a strange, fleeting kind of peace. He would touch me with a reverence that was at odds with the killer he was, his hands, one smooth and perfect, the other a canvas of dark, violent ink, mapping my body as if it were a new, undiscovered country, and I, in turn, would cling to him, my body a willing surrender, my heart a traitorous, fluttering thing in my chest. I was in love with him. The realization was no longer a terrifying, shocking thing. It was a simple, undeniable fact, a part of the new, strange, and brutal landscape of my life. I was in love with a monster, a killer, a king of a dark and violent world, and in the quiet, secret corners of my own heart, I was beginning to realize that I was no longer just his captive. I was his queen. The war had changed us both. Dmitri was still a monster. I was not naive enough to believe otherwise. I would see the darkness in his eyes when he returned late at night, the ghost of violence clinging to him like a shroud. I would see the blood on his knuckles that he couldn't quite wash away. He was a killer, a ruthless king in a brutal kingdom, but he was my monster, my king, and his love for me, the raw, possessive, and utterly consuming thing that had been born in the crucible of our shared war, had become his anchor, a humanizing force in the heart of his dark, violent world. And I was no longer the innocent, naive academic who had stepped off the plane in a haze of grief and terror. I was a queen forged in blood and fire, a woman who had looked into the abyss and had not flinched. I was comfortable with my power, with my place in this dark and brutal world. I had found a strange, terrifying, and beautiful kind of peace in the heart of the storm. One afternoon, I was presiding over a meeting of the Sovetniki, Dmitri's inner circle of advisors. He was in St. Petersburg, dealing with a minor but persistent problem with the port authorities. He had left me in charge, a silent, implicit, and utterly revolutionary act of trust. The men in the room, the hard, older men who had once looked at me with such cold, dismissive contempt, now looked at me with a mixture of fear and a grudging, almost fearful respect. I sat at the head of the long, polished table in Dmitri's office, in his chair, a small, black-clad figure in a room of large, intimidating men. They were discussing a problem with a new, ambitious Chechen gang that was trying to move into our territory. The conversation was a stalemate, a circular argument of brute force and escalating violence. I listened in silence, my hands clasped loosely on the polished surface of the desk, when they had finally exhausted their options, their bluster, their threats. I spoke. My voice was a clear, quiet, and utterly unforgiving thing in the sudden, shocked silence of the room. I did not propose a war. I did not propose a negotiation. I proposed a vivisection, a cold, surgical, and utterly devastating dismantling of the Chechen gang's power structure. From the inside out, it was a plan based not on brute force, but on a deep, intimate understanding of our enemies' weaknesses, their vanities, their greed. It was a plan that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. It was a plan that Dmitri himself would have been proud of. When I finished, the silence in the room was absolute. The men around the table looked at me, their faces a mask of a new, profound, and utterly terrifying understanding. They were not just looking at the Pakhansjena, they were looking at their Tsarina. That night, Dmitri returned. He found me in the library, a fire roaring in the hearth, a glass of whiskey in my hand. He did not speak. He simply came to stand behind my chair, his hands coming to rest on my shoulders, his presence a warm, solid, and comforting weight at my back. "Victor told me about the meeting," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble against my ear, and I asked. My own voice, a cool, steady thing. "And," he said, his hands tightening on my shoulders, a flicker of a fierce, proud, and utterly possessive pride in his voice. "I believe I am in the presence of a queen." He turned my chair to face him, and he knelt before me, his large, powerful body a gesture of a surrender so profound, so absolute. It stole the breath from my lungs. He took my hand, the one that wore his heavy, ornate gold band, and he raised it to his lips. "You are my queen, Anya," he whispered, his lips a warm, reverent caress against my skin. My partner, my equal, my life. He was a king, kneeling at the feet of his queen, a monster, bowing to the woman who had tamed him, not with gentleness, not with light, but with a matching darkness, a matching strength. Our love was not a gentle, kind, or easy thing. It was a dark, violent, and utterly consuming force of nature. It was a fire that had forged us both into something new, something stronger, something more dangerous. Later that night, as we lay tangled in the sheets of his vast dark bed, the city of Moscow a glittering, indifferent carpet of lights outside the window, he turned to me, his eyes a dark, molten fire in the dim light. "There is one last thing we must do," he said, his voice a low, serious thing. The next morning, we drove to a small, quiet, and snow-covered cemetery on the outskirts of the city. It was the place where my parents were buried, their simple, unadorned graves, a stark, silent testament to the quiet, scholarly life they had pretended to live. We stood before their graves, two dark, silent figures in the vast, white landscape. The air was still, the silence absolute, broken only by the soft, mournful sigh of the wind through the bare branches of the birch trees. I did not feel grief. I did not feel anger. I felt a strange, cold, and profound sense of peace. I had avenged them. I had claimed their legacy. I had become the woman they had raised me not to be, but the woman they had, in their own strange, brutal way, always known I was. Dmitri's hand found mine, his fingers, strong and calloused and stained with the ink of his violent life, lacing through my own. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply stood beside me, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in a world of ghosts. We were not there to mourn the dead. We were there to honor the legacy of the living. As we turned to leave, I looked at the man beside me, at the king of this dark and brutal kingdom, at the monster I had fallen in love with. And I knew, with a cold, hard, and utterly terrifying certainty, that our story was not a story of redemption. It was not a story of light conquering darkness. It was a story of two dark, broken souls finding a perfect, albeit twisted, harmony in the shadows. We were the Tsarina and the Tsar, and this was our kingdom, a kingdom of ashes, from which we had both, together, been reborn.